We're now going to consider which contracts have macro functionality executed when a macro is triggered by a hotkey. Before we begin, let's first consider how it works for base functions. When a base function is triggered by a hotkey, then whether or not the function will execute is dependent on the trading state associated with the contract. If a trading state is on, the function will execute. If a trading state is off, the function will not execute. How it works for macros is different. Let's look at the macro builder. As we can see here, every macro in the macro list is able to have an execution approach assigned to it. There are 3 different settings for execution approach: safety high, medium, and low. If a macro is run with an execution approach of safety high, this means that the functionality will not execute unless every contract referenced by that macro has its trading state on. If a macro is run with an execution approach of safety medium, this means that all the functions which are associated with contracts whose trading states are on will execute. All the functions which are associated with contracts whose trading states are off will not execute. If a macro is run with a safety low execution approach, this means that trading state is ignored and all of the functions are going to be executed. There are a few caveats to mention here. As we discussed earlier, macros can be called from other macros. So what happens if a macro which has an execution approach assigned to it of safety medium references another macro which has a safety low or safety high execution approach? The way that it works is that if a macro references other macros, then at runtime, the maximum safety level for all the referenced macros is a safety level which is applied. The other caveat has to do with another window called Workspace Settings. A macro is not going to execute if it refers to any contracts which are unavailable unless this checkbox is checked. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what execution approach is assigned, it's not going to execute anything at all. Let's bring everything together now. As we can see here, there are 4 different trading views showing. 3 of them are associated with a contract whose trading states are on, and 1 of them is associated with a contract whose trading state is off. If we had a macro which contained references to each of these 4 contracts, then when would functionality execute for each contract? If we ran a macro under a high safety execution approach, functionality would not execute for any of the 4 contracts because 1 of the 4 contracts has its trading state off. If we ran a macro under a medium safety execution approach, functionality would execute for the 1st, 3rd, and 4th contracts. If we ran our macro under a low safety execution approach, functionality would execute for every single contract. Before we finish up, I just want to mention a few caveats. The first is that there's a few functions which control trading state itself. These are executable as base functions, even if the trading state is off. The last item is that all the functionality discussed is not able to be executed unless the hotkeys are subscribed. For more information, see the help file.